So China just dropped a bombshell of a number. Its trade surplus has officially crossed the $1 trillion mark. But what if I told you that number, the largest in recorded history by the way, is actually an underestimate? We're about to break down how this absolutely massive global imbalance is even possible. That's right. When you actually dig into the data, some economists think the real number is closer to $1.2 trillion. And get this, to put that in perspective, this surplus has grown 20-fold in just the last 2 decades. It's an economic force that is literally reshaping our world. So the central question, the one we're all thinking, is just how? How is this even possible? How does one single country end up selling so much more to the rest of the world than it buys back? Well, let's find out.
Okay, first things first, we need to look under the hood and understand the engine that's driving all of this, China's incredible, world-beating export machine.
You know, this whole trillion-dollar mystery really boils down to 2 pretty simple questions. 1, why does China export so much? And 2, why does it import so little? Let's tackle that first question, the export side.
Part of the answer is just simple, mind-boggling scale. I mean, China's economy has absolutely exploded from less than $1 trillion back in the late 90s to around $18 trillion today. When an economy gets that massive, the numbers it produces are naturally going to be gigantic.
But here's some really important context. While $1 trillion sounds just insane, when you look at it relative to the size of its economy, China's surplus is actually smaller than some other major exporters. It's about 3% of its GDP. Compare that to Germany, which is sitting at 7%. So yeah, size is a big part of the story, but it's definitely not the whole story.
And that brings us to the second, and you could argue more important factor, raw industrial competitiveness. We're not just talking about being big, we're talking about being ruthlessly, unbelievably efficient at making things the rest of the world desperately wants to buy.
Just get a load of this. A recent study found that in some really key industries, a Chinese worker can be 2 to 3 times more productive than an American worker, while earning 80% less. That combination of way higher output for way lower costs, that is an almost unbeatable formula for global exports. And the result of that formula is just pure dominance. China now accounts for a staggering 35% of all global manufacturing. That is roughly the same amount as the next 10 biggest manufacturing countries combined. Let that sink in.
And listen, this isn't just about cheap toys and t-shirts anymore. The most recent growth is being supercharged by these high-tech sectors, like semiconductors and electric vehicles, industries where China is quickly becoming a world leader.
All right, so that's the export side of the equation, a massive, efficient machine. But that's only half the story. Now we have to ask the other question. Why isn't China buying more from the rest of us?
And this is where things get really heated. Because you have to remember, for every country with a giant trade surplus, there has to be another country with a giant trade deficit. And for decades, that country has been the United States. So, who's really responsible for this thing?
Well, economists are pretty split. In one camp, you have people pointing the finger at China. They talk about policies like keeping its currency artificially low to make exports cheaper, or suppressing wages, so its own people can't afford to buy as many imports. But then the other camp blames the U.S., pointing to its own spending habits, running these huge budget deficits that have to be financed by foreign money, which almost automatically creates a trade deficit.
So what's the real answer? Well, like with most things in complex global economics, it's not really an either-or situation. The most likely truth is that the policies and the economic structures in both countries are feeding into this massive and very persistent imbalance.
Okay, so this brings us to a really fascinating puzzle. The US launched a huge trade war specifically to fix this exact problem. So why on earth did the surplus get even bigger?
At first, it actually looked like the tariffs were having an effect. China's direct shipments to the US did drop, but then something else happened. At the exact same time, China's exports to places like Vietnam and Mexico and Europe, they just shot through the roof. So it wasn't that China was selling less, it was just selling to different middlemen.
And this all happened because of a clever little workaround called transshipment. The idea is simple, really. If you can't ship directly from country A to country B because the taxes are too high, you just find a country C to act as a go-between.
Here's how it works in the real world. The US slaps a huge tariff on Chinese goods.
So a Chinese company just ships those same goods to, say, Vietnam. Over there, the products might get a tiny bit of final assembly, or maybe they just get relabeled. Then they're shipped from Vietnam to the US, completely bypassing that original tariff. It's basically trade finding a crack in the wall.
And here's the punchline. If you look at the official numbers, America's trade deficit with China got smaller. Great! But America's overall deficit with the entire world didn't shrink one bit. All the tariffs really did was shuffle the deficit from one country's column over to another. It didn't solve the underlying problem at all. So all of this leads us to the final and most critical question. How long can this possibly last? I mean, a global imbalance of this size just feels unsustainable. But is it? You know, this quote from a recent economic analysis really sums up what people are thinking now. A lot of the experts who are predicting this whole system would collapse are starting to realize that it's surprisingly resilient. The status quo, it seems, might be way more stable than we thought.
And when you put all the pieces together, you can kind of see why. China has proven that it's incredibly good at finding new customers and using these workarounds like transshipment. And at the exact same time, the US hasn't really managed to change the fundamental spending and borrowing habits that fuel its side of the great imbalance.
And that leaves us with a truly provocative and, frankly, kind of unsettling thought for the future. We've just seen that China's export engine is now moving full steam ahead into high-tech, high-value goods like electric cars and advanced computer chips. So if China's surplus is already at a record $1.2 trillion today, what happens when that new engine hits full throttle? Is the global economy even prepared for what might come next?